So Argilac the Arrogant rode forth from Storm's End one last time to meet his foes in the open field. The writings of Archmaester Gildane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. While Aegon was burning Harrenhal into the twisted ruins we see today, further south across the Blackwater Rush and out into the other side of the Kingswood, House Baratheon and Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, with the bulk of the Targaryen army, set out to face the Storm King, Argella Durrandon. The bannermen of the Storm King would prove to be much more loyal than Harren the Black's rivermen, who had turned on their king at the first opportunity. King Argilac the Arrogant rallied his bannermen around him at his ancient seat of the Storm Kings, Storm's End. While the castle was much smaller than the likes of Harrenhal, most men agreed it was all but impregnable, and had proven so for thousands of years. But when news of his old enemy Harren's demise in the blaze of the black dragon flame, it was clear even the ancient walls of Storm's End would not stop a dragon. And Argilac knew that this host on his borders had such a dragon of their own. Lords Fell, Buckler and Errol had been harassing the Targaryen army as they marched through the Kingswood, that is, until Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes burned half the wood and killed Lord Errol in the process. Buckler and Fell, with their broken and burned army, managed to reach Storm's End to tell their king of the presence of the dragon Meraxes. With that, the old warrior king roared that he did not intend to die as Harren had, cooked inside his own castle like a suckling pig, with an apple in his mouth. No stranger to battle, having won countless heroic victories himself, he would decide his own fate with a sword in hand. So Argilac the Arrogant rode forth from Storm's End one last time to meet his foes in the open field. While Argilac is remembered as the Arrogant, we must grant him plaudits where it's due. He had the courage to face his foe, to face the dragon in the field, while the so-called mighty Harren the Black feasted in his hall and burned. Argilac had grown older, his famous mane of black hair had gone grey, and his prowess at arms had faded. The writings of Archmaester Gildane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. At this stage, the element of surprise had been lost by both sides of the looming battle. Both knew what to expect from the opposing side. The Storm King's approach was expected by House Baratheon and his men. However, some had indeed expected him to remain and defend Storm's End. Queen Rhaenys, flying Meraxes, had witnessed Argilac's departure from his castle and was able to give the Hand of the King a full accounting of his enemy's numbers and dispositions. While we cannot know the number of each side of the battle for certainty due to the known amount of losses House Targaryen took on the march, we know at least they were outnumbered by the Stormlanders, at least 2-1. With that, Orys decided that his best option was to decide the battlefield himself and let Argilac come to him. They would take up a strong position on the hills south of Bronzegate and dug in there on the high ground to await the coming of the Stormlanders. As the two armies came together, the Stormlands proved true to their name. A steady rain began to fall, and by midday it turned into a howling gale the likes had not been seen for many years. Some more poetic scholars like to claim this was the Stormlands coming to the aid of its king. But it seems not even the power of nature itself could stop the roaring fires of House Targaryen. The storm became so severe, some of King Argilac's bannermen urged him to delay his attack until the following day, in hopes the rain would pass. But the Storm King, outnumbering the conquerors almost 2-1, had almost 4 times as many knights and heavy horses, which in itself in theory should be enough to end the battle rather quickly, dragon or not. But this was no normal battle, and in truth Argilac lived up to his moniker, the Arrogant. They say it was the sight of the 3-headed dragon banner of House Targaryen, flapping sodden above his own land, that enraged him. Battle-seasoned old warrior did not fail to note the rain was blowing from the south as well, directly into the faces of the Baratheon army on the hills. So Argilac the Arrogant gave the command to attack, and the battle known to history as the Last Storm began. The battle was long and bloody, and lasted well into the night, and was far less one-sided than Aegon's conquest of Harrenhal. Some even like to argue that the Last Storm was the most difficult and costly battle across the whole of Wars of Conquest, the bitter old Storm King putting up a hell of a last stand. 3 times Argilac the Arrogant personally led his knights on a mad charge against the Baratheon position up top the hills. But the slopes were steep, and the rains had turned the ground into a soft and muddy mess, so the warhorses struggled and floundered, and the chargers lost a lot of their cohesion and movement, and with that, Argilac's biggest asset was drastically weakened. While in theory less effective than mounted knights, the Stormlanders fared better when they sent up their spearmen up the hills in foot. The progress was slow, but blinded by the rain and the wind, the conquerors did not see them climbing up the hill till it was too late. More so, the rain had dampened the bowstrings of the archers and made their bows all but useless at longer ranges, and taking out a lot of the power needed to bring down more armoured attackers. One hill fell, then another, and on the 4th and final charge, the Storm King and his knights broke through the Baratheon centre on the final hill, and for a brief moment it seemed like the old Storm King had done the impossible and beaten the immense power of House Targaryen. In the clamour of battle, they had forgotten one key detail. They had indeed broken the Baratheon line, as Orys had always intended them to. As they did, they came face to face with Queen Rhaenys Targaryen and her mighty dragon Meraxes, and in a moment, all was lost. Even on the ground, a dragon proves to be a formidable beast. Dickon Morrigan and the Bastard of Blackhaven, commanding the vanguard, were engulfed in dragon flame instantly, along with the other knights of Argilac's personal guard. The warhorses panicked and fled in terror, crashing into riders behind them and turning the charge into chaos. Men were ablaze, screaming all around him as the Storm King himself was thrown from his saddle, but miraculously, he survived the encounter. Yet still, Argilac, the old Storm King, continued to battle on. He still had one last fight in him, with the old warrior wanting the death of a warrior. On his feet, with a sword in his hand. When Orys Baratheon came down the muddy hill with his own men, he found the old king holding off 6 men on his own, with as many corpses at his feet. "Stand aside," Baratheon commanded. He dismounted, so to meet the king on equal footing, and offered the Storm King one last chance to yield. Argilac spat and cursed him instead, and so they fought. The old warrior king with his streaming white hair and Aegon's fierce, black-bearded half-brother. Each man took a wound from the other, both said to be quite serious. But in the end, the last of the Durrandons got his wish, and the old Storm King died with a sword in his hand and a curse for Orys upon his lips. Despite the varied opinions of Argilac, most agree he died with more honour than the other kings of Westeros during the Wars of Conquest, and thus he is remembered for that. As you would expect, the death of their king took all heart out of the Stormlanders, and as the word spread that Argilac had fallen, his lords and knights threw down their swords and fled, or bent the knee to Orys and Rhaenys, who looked down at the battlefield from atop her dragon. These terms Argilac the Arrogant rejected angrily. Orys Baratheon was a base-born half-brother to Lord Aegon, it was whispered, and the Storm King would not dishonour his daughter by giving her hand to a bastard. The writings of Archmaester Gildane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. In the days after the last storm, the news of the Baratheon victory spread quickly, by the men fleeing the battlefield and running south. It was feared for a few days that the ancient castle of Storm's End might suffer the same fate as Harrenhal. While Argilac was dead and the line of Storm Kings ended, he did still have one child, his beloved daughter Argella, the very daughter he refused to allow Orys Baratheon to marry, destroying any hope of a peaceful coexistence of House Targaryen. Argella was very much her father's daughter, and barred her gates at the approach of Orys and the Targaryen host, and declared herself the first Storm Queen. For a while it seemed like the burning of Storm's End was all but inevitable, as Rhaenys and Orys had no taste for a lengthy siege. So rather than bend the knee, the defenders of Storm's End would die to the last man she promised. When Queen Rhaenys and Meraxes flew into the castle to parley. "You can take my castle, but you will win only bones and blood and ashes," she announced to Rhaenys. But it seems not all in Storm's End were willing to follow Argella, especially as the tales of Harrenhal were widely known by this point. The garrison proved less eager to die. That night they raised a peace banner, threw open the castle gates, and delivered Argella Durrandon, gagged, chained and naked, to the camp of Orys Baratheon. It is said that Orys unchained her with his own hands, wrapped his cloak around her, poured her wine and spoke gently, telling her of her father's courage and the manner of his death, and afterwards, to honour the fallen king, Orys took the arms and words of House Durrandon for his own. The crowned stag became his sigil, Storm's End became his seat, and Lady Argella his wife, and thus began House Baratheon of Storm's End, while new, through Argella Durrandon, the legacy of the Storm Kings would still endure. A lot of fans like to speculate as to if Orys Baratheon would have still won the last storm without Rhaenys and her dragon. Is actually a very difficult question. We do know that Orys was outnumbered around 2-1, thus why him choosing to fight from the high ground was so important. We also know that in terms of high quality troops, Argilac had a significant amount more mounted knights than Orys. However, the weather and thick mud basically nullified the threat somewhat. It seems that in the text, the battle was going in Argilac's favour, but the truth is, it's really hard to determine how close he came to actually beating Orys in a straight up dragonless fight, because Orys' strategy was to allow Argilac to keep charging up the hill, slowly whittling down his men and luring him into one final Hail Mary, where they would feign their lines breaking to allow for the killing blow via Rhaenys and Meraxes. While Meraxes did play a small role in the battle, Orys' whole approach and plan centered around the dragon. Thus, it's really hard to assess how effective Orys would have been on his own. The relationship between Orys and Argella is interesting, simply because the text gives us so little to work from that we really have no idea what she's really like, or the true extent of her relationship with Orys. The text paints this picture in the space of an evening that the two fell in love, with Orys showing her some basic kindness. While I suppose it's still likely to have happened, and seems in character for what we know of Orys, it also seems just as likely that this marriage was solely a political move from Argella to keep her position and ultimately save her life. Yes, she could have fallen in love with Orys thanks to his kindness to her, but given the timescale we're talking about, in my view, there was certainly some element of political negotiation involved as well.